In the year 865, a great army of Scandinavian warriors appeared off the eastern shores of Britain. In glittering mail with gilded swords and deadly spears, they had come from all corners of the Scandinavian world to bring death upon the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Vikings had come to Britain before. For close to a century, in fact, the dark sails of their dragon boats had been an all too familiar occurrence at remote monasteries and bustling trade centres. They'd even settled down to make new lives for themselves in the far north and across the sea in Ireland. Yet, as the hundreds of war vessels, manned by thousands of battle-hardened warriors, came ashore that summer, amulets of Thor and Odin clearly visible around their necks, it soon became clear that this force was different. It wasn't just that it was a larger army than those that had come before it, it was that this one was headed straight for the jugular. Rather than focusing on wealthy ports and monasteries, this army shot directly for the ruling monarchies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, in an attempt to stamp out their existence entirely and build anew in their own image. After making landfall in East Anglia, an ancient realm that had thrived for 3 centuries since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, they extorted horses from the helpless king, Edmund, before promptly making their way north to the neighbouring kingdom of Northumbria, once the most powerful of the lot, now beset by civil war. Within weeks they succeeded in killing the king of Northumbria, Aelle, and conquering the land for themselves. Rather than heading back aboard their ships, laden down with plunder and prisoners, this great army of Norsemen and Danes, likely drawn from every Viking settlement in northern Europe, remained upon the island, heading back south to East Anglia before long to make a martyr out of King Edmund and claim his kingdom too. They hadn't just come to plunder, this time they'd come to conquer and to settle the land, and after they were finished, nothing would ever be the same again. By 878, after a 13-year blitzkrieg, which saw the destruction of every Anglo-Saxon realm bar one, the last remaining kingdom, Wessex, and its young king, Alfred, managed to defeat the last remnants of the Great Army at a place named Edington in Wiltshire. Alfred had saved his kingdom, but as the smoke cleared from the maelstrom of violence that had become the norm over the past decade and more, the political map of Britain had been completely redrawn. In the place of the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the southern portion of the island, and sitting firmly alongside the original inhabitants of the far north, now resided a plethora of new Viking states. As the weeks, months and years went by, it became clear to Alfred and his contemporaries that, like it or not, the Vikings were here to stay. A new age had dawned, and the older inhabitants of Britain would either have to adapt to it or go down in flames. The Viking chieftain who Alfred had defeated at Edington was Guthrum, a ruthless sea king who had probably arrived slightly later than the original leaders of the Great Heathen Army, Ivar, Halfdan and Ubba, all already dead by this point, younger warlords having taken their places. In the aftermath of Edington, Guthrum, the last great leader of the army, seems to have had a change of heart. Rather than joining his old comrades in Valhalla, he moved back eastwards to settle down in East Anglia and rule as a king. Yet, unlike most of the other Vikings in Britain at this time, he brought back with him something from Wessex, a uniquely non-Viking characteristic. When Guthrum settled his warriors in East Anglia that year, he went as a Christian, under the new name Athelstan, with Alfred as his godfather. However much this may have been a ruse to begin with, this change of character apparently seems to have remained with Guthrum for the rest of his days. For a decade to come, whilst East Anglia likely still harboured nests of Vikings coming over from the continent to raid, Guthrum wouldn't go to war again. He'd changed, and in doing so, he'd laid the foundations for the conversion of many more of his kin over the years to come, perhaps a precursor to the eventual integration between Saxon and Dane that would occur over the next century and more. Whilst Saxon culture inevitably rubbed off on at least some Vikings after they had come to Britain, the reverse is true as well. Scores of people from the lowest rungs of Anglo-Saxon society are thought to have escaped from slavery to become Vikings themselves, seeking service aboard longships and within warbands. Perhaps most importantly, however, Alfred and the West Saxon political elite adopted the Scandinavian tendency to fortify certain settlements against outside attack, a policy not usually used before this time. Throughout Wessex, these new strongholds, known as burhs, began to spring up to act as a safe haven for local people from attack. These fortified settlements gave enough time for townspeople and farmers to fend off attackers behind their walls and await relief forces. In time, these burhs would become the large towns of the medieval period, and in many cases, the cities that we know today. To the south of East Anglia lay Essex, the old realm of the East Saxons, a marshy land of inlets and waterways, long under the sway of Wessex before the coming of the Vikings. Essex would remain a den for pirates and incoming Scandinavians from the continent for decades to come, though small pockets of fearful East Saxons still clung on to normal life as much as they could amidst the reeds and the marshes. For the most part, they now looked fearfully to new Scandinavian overlords. Still further to the south lay Kent, the oldest Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Like Essex, Kent had long been a vassal of the West Saxons, yet still retained its own unique culture and local rulers. There, a hard-fought war had been waged against the Scandinavians during the 860s and 870s, and finally, with Alfred's victory at Edington in 878, some relief had come for the battered inhabitants of England's far southeastern extremity, though places off the shore, such as the Isle of Sheppey, would remain staging posts for Vikings for generations to come. All along the southern coast of Wessex, trading towns such as Southampton had once thrived as centres of commerce, seeing incoming vessels from Francia and Frisia bring in their wares from as far afield as the Mediterranean. Now many of these centres lay abandoned, their inhabitants either having fled or been enslaved by Viking raiders. Further west still, at the far extremity of southern Britain, lay the old realm of the Britons. This was a truly ancient place, older than any of the Saxon realms, and one never fully subjugated by their West Saxon neighbours. There, the kings of Dumnonia bided their time in their ancient castles and hilltop fortresses, waiting for the perfect moment to try and reclaim their lost lands. It was a realm that had existed since the legendary Age of Heroes in the 5th century that gave rise to the tale of King Arthur, a century or more before the supremacy of the Anglo-Saxons. They saw in the coming of the Vikings a means by which to pursue their own independence struggle against Wessex, not only providing a safe haven at times for Viking newcomers, but even allying themselves with them on occasion to fight back against their old enemy. Just to the north, across the Bristol Channel, lay the similarly ancient kingdoms of Wales. Like Dumnonia, they were Brythonic-speaking survivors from the chaotic mess of warlords and invasions that followed the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 5th century. A dizzying array of kingdoms and principalities had long existed there in the mountains and valleys, long pitting their warriors against each other in a centuries-long struggle for supremacy, both against fellow Welshmen and against the Anglo-Saxons across the border to the east. Just like in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of modern-day England, the Viking Age had been tough on the Welsh kings, in particular the southwestern kingdom of Dyfed, the Welshmen there having suffered incursion after incursion from the thriving Viking towns that had sprung up across the sea in Ireland. At first, these raiders had carried off goods and plunder back to the slave markets and bartering grounds of Dublin and Waterford, but before long, they began to overwinter in Wales, using islands and coves that still bear unmistakably Norse names today, such as Flatholm, as staging grounds for further raids. Unlike in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, however, and in the far north of Britain, these inroads never amounted to much more than brief overwinters and small colonies. In the northern Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd, however, traditionally one of the strongest of the Welsh kingdoms, and long ago a real contender for the position of superpower in Britain during that murky epoch that followed the exodus of the Romans, something quite extraordinary had happened during the Viking Age. A powerful leader had arisen there, one who, like Alfred in Wessex, is traditionally regarded in the Welsh chronicles as truly deserving the title of Great. Rhodri the Great, King of Gwynedd, not only successfully fought off his share of Viking raiders in the 850s and 860s, just as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to burn on the eastern side of Britain, but he managed to use the renown he gained from defending his borders to further exert his influence outside of his traditional heartlands. The neighbouring Welsh kingdom of Powys, immediately to the east, was the first to fall, and before long he sent his warriors south into Ceredigion and towards Dyfed. For the first time in well over 200 years, Gwynedd was growing. Before long, like Alfred in Wessex, Rhodri began to conceive of the idea of a strong unified Wales, an unheard of and seemingly impossible concept up until this point. Just like in Wessex, it was outside invasion from the Vikings, and the unity forged out of the necessity of fighting back that had made this a reality. In 878, however, just as Alfred won his great victory against Guthrum and thus solidified his nation's survival, Rhodri faced an outside invasion of his own, not from the Vikings this time, but from the Mercian kingdom to his east, traditionally the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom before the rise of Wessex in the first half of the 9th century, and still a contender for power even with Vikings settling down all over its eastern portion, and a puppet king on the throne. Rhodri died that year in 878, killed in battle by Mercian swords. His sons, however, placed on the thrones of Gwynedd, Powys and Cyslewig by the Mercian lords, themselves likely wishing to curtail any potential of a powerful unified Wales on their doorstep, Rhodri's sons vowed to uphold his cause, knowing that one day, and soon, the Vikings would return. To the east, meanwhile, times had been hard in Mercia of late. That puppet ruler now in charge was Ceolwulf, the last Mercian king in history, and one of uncertain origins. The last fully legitimate king, Burgred, had fled to Rome in 874 in fear for his life, having witnessed the kings of Northumbria and East Anglia being murdered, one after the other, their royal lines extinguished forever. Yet with Alfred's victory in 878 had come a brief respite, for the western portion of Mercia at least, which remained under its own native nobility, divided from the Danish-held east by the old Roman road of Watling Street. That eastern portion of Mercia, soon to be known as the Five Boroughs, wasn't so lucky, being permanently ceded to the Vikings, who began to settle there in large numbers, leaving a permanent trace on the 5 borough towns of Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, Stamford and Lincoln for generations to come, and a remaining legacy in place names to this day. In the western portion of Mercia, Saxon control lingered on as a shadow of its former self, under the control of Ceolwulf, seeing more and more nobles and farmers alike fleeing across the border from the east to bolster their numbers. Though just across the Thames to the south, the ever-expansionist and ambitious Alfred gazed northwards, seeking to exert his influence there and make the Kingdom of Mercia the first piece of his jigsaw puzzle of a unified Angle land. To the north of the 5 boroughs, past the inhospitable fens, the Wash and the River Humber, lay Northumbria, once made up of 2 distinct Anglian kingdoms that had carved out kingdoms for themselves from the formerly Romano-Briton-held lands during the 6th and 7th centuries. The southernmost, Deira, was based around the town of Eofawich by the Humber estuary. The other, Bernicia, had its seat of power at the formidable fortress of Bebbanburg, modern-day Bamborough, on the eastern coast. The 2 kingdoms had been unified under a single monarchy during the 7th century, though the fall of Eofawich in the 860s to the Great Viking army saw this fragile unity crumble away for good. By 878, Eofawich had been under Scandinavian rule for over a decade, and in that time it had gained a new name. Over the years and decades to come, it would become one of the largest cities in Northern Europe, a bastion for Viking culture and trade for more than 2 centuries to come. There, goods and commodities from afar afield as Central Asia, Constantinople, Northern Africa and Italy flowed into the packed city streets and markets, making its rulers and townspeople wealthy and prosperous in the process. That settlement was, of course, the city of Yorvik, a Viking city which would soon begin to rival Dublin in commercial importance for the Scandinavians of Britain and Northern Europe. In the first few years after the Great Heathen Army conquered Northumbria, the leaders of the expedition, Ivar, Halfdan and Ubba, had set up a puppet ruler in order to legitimise their rule and to ease the transition to Scandinavian overlordship, much like they later did in Mercia. His name was Egbert, but soon enough they did away with him completely. By the mid-870s, having finally given up on conquering Wessex, Halfdan had himself made king in Northumbria, much like Guthrum would do slightly later in East Anglia, though unlike Guthrum, Halfdan remained resolutely a pagan. He and his warriors settled the land, likely bringing over women and children from Scandinavia, but also intermarrying with the locals. At least some semblance of Anglo-Saxon identity survived in Deira, yet the language and place names became notably Scandinavian for more than a century to come. Though soon enough, by around 877, Halfdan was on the move again, heading across the sea this time to Ireland to stake a claim to the Kingdom of Dublin. He was killed there within the confines of a bleak northern loch off the northern Irish coast, and in the wake of his death, Northumbria came under the rule of a coalition of ruling magnates and power brokers for close to a decade to come. Interestingly, by the time a Scandinavian king again came to rule in the north, by the name of Guthfrith, just like Guthrum Athelstan in East Anglia, he may have been, at least in part, a Christian king, and certainly tolerated the Christian beliefs of his subjects. Even if he didn't understand the Christian faith as the Anglo-Saxons did, perhaps, like other Vikings seemed to do in the early years of their interaction with Christianity, he merely added Jesus to his existing list of deities alongside Odin and Thor, in order to hedge his bets. Further north along the coast lay Bebbanburg, an imposing cliff-top citadel perched atop a rocky outcrop facing into the cold North Sea. Once home to the ancient line of Bernician kings, Bebbanburg had never been conquered during its centuries-long history, and now the lords of Bamborough looked on with horror as they saw their southern rivals decimated and colonised by warriors from beyond the sea. Yet, as the years went by and the dust and bloodshed of the initial invasion finally settled, the Anglian lords of the north began to see the Viking invasion as an opportunity in itself, a chance to exert their own independence once more. For close to a century to come, until the reign of Alfred the Great's grandson Athelstan saw the emergence of a unified Angleland become a reality in the 920s, albeit only for a short time, this unique and remote enclave of Anglian culture and language survived up there in the north, beset on all sides by Vikings to the south, Britons from Cumbria to the west, and the rapidly merging cultures of the Scots and the Picts from the north. In time, another powerful foe would emerge too, in the form of Irish Vikings, possible descendants of Ivar the Boneless, ruthless pagan warriors who sought to exert their authority from their power base of Dublin across the Irish Sea to control the entirety of the north of modern-day England. Up until the time of the Great Heathen Army, Vikings had arguably had their greatest successes of all in Ireland, where they had ravaged monasteries since the end of the 8th century, and eventually established thriving commercial centres. There, ancient kingdoms and dynasties had set aside their differences for a time to do battle against the newcomers, some of whom had originated from the north, sailing around the northern tip of Britain from Norway, others having arrived from the south, spilling out of the river systems of West Francia, one of the rapidly fragmenting remnants of Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire, once hailed as the father of Europe, now rife with feuding local lords and brimming with nests of piratical raiders. Yet, before long, not only did the Irish kings fall back to their old ways of doing battle against one another, but some even began to recruit Vikings to fight in their battles for them. This allowed the Vikings to fully integrate themselves into the existing political system as swords for hire. Later still, temporary Scandinavian settlements on river mouths became prosperous towns, Dublin being the largest, but other notable settlements growing up at Waterford, Wexford, Limerick and Cork. By 878, the lines had already begun to blur between Norsemen, Irish and Dane. Scandinavian Vikings could just as often be seen fighting against each other in the armies of regional Irish kings, as they fought as a unified force against Irishmen, most notably the various branches of the Uí Néill clan that held sway in the north, often recruited the men of Dublin, whereas for the kings of Munster in the south, from where the famous Brian Boru would arise a century later, maritime support often came from the Vikings of Limerick. The late 870s are often seen as a time of relative peace between Vikings and Irishmen, the former having already integrated themselves to a certain extent into the political system, though it wouldn't be long before their descendants again began to grow in power, eventually seizing control of Yorvik by the 910s and terrorising both sides of the Irish Sea for decades to come. Just to the north of Ireland, within the sprawling mass of archipelagos and islands that lie between modern-day Ulster and western Scotland, the line between Viking and Gael had begun to blur even more than in Ireland. There had once existed a powerful kingdom, originating to the south, that had spread north to encompass the majority of Scotland's rugged western coastline. Its name was Dalriada, and for a time in the 5th and 6th centuries, it had been one of the most powerful realms in Britain, launching campaigns far afield to the Isle of Man and the Orkneys, as well as against the growing power of Northumbria. Times were hard up on the west coast of Scotland during the Viking Age, and by the late 8th century, the inhabitants of Dalriada were one of the first areas to be hit. After Norwegians began raiding the shores of the Hebrides in the late 8th century, intensifying their raids during the 9th, and finally settling down to colonise by the 820s and 830s, the Dalriadans were forced to either move east or adapt to a new life under new overlords. Many of them did, pledging their allegiance to an incoming Norse warrior elite, some of them retaining their old ways largely unchanged, others entirely or partly adopting Norse customs and even religion. By the 870s, intermarriage and merging had become so common that it was now almost impossible to differentiate between Norse and Gael, leading to the emergence of a brand new, uniquely Norse Gael culture. The Scottish Isles would remain resolutely unique with its blend of Scandinavian and Gaelic culture until well into the late medieval period. Those of the Dalriadan elite who had fled during the early days of the invasions found there in the rugged mountains and deep forests of the north a mysterious and elusive people. Painted men, the Romans had called them, covering themselves in intricate tattoos with wild long hair. Separated from much of the rest of Britain by the difficulty and harshness of their natural geography, the Picts had lived up there in the north for millennia, long fighting against the Romans for their independence, never fully being subjugated despite numerous hard-fought attempts. The Picts, however, remain one of the most unfortunate casualties of the Viking Age. Their unique pictorial script has never been fully deciphered, meaning they remain one of those all too unfortunate cultures who are unable to tell us their own story. Instead, we have to rely on others, such as the Gaels, to tell it for them. It seems that the Picts fought their own series of wars against the Vikings, winning some battles, but for the most part being pushed back, just like their neighbours the Dalriadans to the west. Eventually, these two formerly distinct people began to merge, likely making common cause out of the necessity of survival. The 9th century is an incredibly murky time in the north of Britain, with very little concrete evidence remaining to confirm what happened. But out of the chaotic mess of waves of invasion, a new culture emerged, possibly instigated by some members of the exiled Dalriadan warrior elite, along with a sizable Pictish population. The first great leader of the north was Kenneth MacAlpine, allegedly a former Dalriadan king, but in the records apparently calling himself King of the Picts. Before long, this new royal family began to call themselves Kings of the Scots, a Gaelic term previously used to refer to residents of Dalriada. By the 10th century, Pictish culture had died out entirely, only to be replaced by a new Scottish one. Just like the House of Rhodri in northern Wales and the House of Alfred in Wessex, this new elite would in time form a strong centralised state, eventually expanding outwards to encompass the entirety of the north. Though in 878, the kings of the north engaged themselves still in a baptism of fire, waging a lengthy, largely undocumented war against Viking invasions, perhaps even more brutal than those fought in England and Wales. Yet there was another kingdom in the north too, formerly based at the imposing citadel of Dumbarton Rock on the coast of the River Clyde. After surviving intact for more than 3 centuries, the citadel was finally sacked and destroyed by Vikings in the 870s, perhaps under Ivar the Boneless. Yet these hardy people pushed on, re-establishing a new base of power slightly upriver, the burnt-out remnants of their original ancient capital still visible upon the horizon. Like the Welsh and the Cornish, these people were Britons, the last vestige of the old North kingdoms that thrived in the wake of the Roman imperial extraction and before the coming of the Anglo-Saxons. The kings of Strathclyde were destined to merge somewhat with the Vikings over the coming years, retaining their own Brythonic culture and language, but adopting Viking raiding and fighting techniques, as well as actual Viking settlers in Galloway for a time. Over the coming years, Strathclyde extended its tendrils south into Cumbria, the seat of the ancient kingdom of Regeth, extinguished long ago by the kings of Northumbria. Like Gwynedd in northern Wales, as a result of the coming of the Vikings, Strathclyde was growing larger. Yet still, the rulers of all these disparate kingdoms and cultures knew that just over the sea in northern Europe, within the sprawling rivers of Francia, the mudflats of Denmark, the fjords and mountains of Norway, and amidst the marshes of Frisia, ever larger fleets of Vikings amassed day by day, drilling, training, and preparing themselves to try their luck once more against the kingdoms of Britain.